The visit by a far-right Israeli government minister to the third holiest site in Islam has caused an international outcry. However, the European Union's response has remained curiously muted. The Palestinian leadership denounced Itamar Ben-Gvir for deliberate and unprecedented provocation at the Al-Aqsa mosque compound in occupied East Jerusalem. Arab allies, including the UAE and Egypt, backed calls for action at the United Nations, as well as Turkiye, and even more notably, China. But the question is, where's Europe? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. The revered Al-Aqsa mosque compound is a frequent flashpoint of the decades-long Israeli occupation of East Jerusalem. It's also where Jews believe the biblical Jewish temples once stood, known to them as Temple Mount. Itamar Ben-Gvir defied warnings by Israeli politicians not to inflame tensions. The new Israeli National Security Minister said he wouldn't surrender to Hamas threats not to go to the site. Incidents like this have led to serious bloodshed in the past. So why are European diplomats not more vocal on an issue that has seen even China and the UAE demand action? And what is the diplomatic trend here? Joining us on the panel today, we have from Seattle in the United States, Ramzy Baroud. He's a journalist and editor of Palestine Chronicle. Meanwhile, in London, there's Nasim Ahmed, who is a political analyst at Middle East Monitor. In Washington, D.C., Giorgio Cafiero, who is a Gulf State Analytics Chief Executive Officer. And in Brussels, Guy Burton, who's adjunct professor at the Brussels School of Governance and an expert on China's relations with the Middle East. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Before we get going, I'm just going to bring some of the viewers up to speed on who Itamar Ben-Gvir is. So he's best known internationally as Israel's National Security Minister at present. However, I think it would be fair to say that within Israel, he's been known for a good deal longer, and he's generally regarded as a far-right politician and leader and head of the Jewish Power Party. He's visited Al-Aqsa Mosque's courtyards many times before, but he's never been there as a minister in the Israeli government until this recent visit. The former Israeli Prime Minister, Yair Lapid, described Ben-Gvir as the most irresponsible man in the Middle East. That was in the context of his recent provocative visit. And he has recently banned the Palestinian flag from public spaces and said that waving the Palestinian flag is an act in support of terrorism. So, Ramzy, I'm going to cross to you first, if I may. You're an editor at Palestine Chronicle. You are, in fact, Palestinian yourself, I believe. So how provocative was this visit for you?
Well, of course, it was very provocative, not just for me, but for all Palestinians. And I think this is exactly what Ben-Gvir has intended to do. He was sending a message to the Palestinian people that, no place in Palestine is off limit to his extremist Zionist Jewish expansionist ideas. And Al-Aqsa Mosque, as we all know, part of Al-Haram al-Sharif, is the holiest of all shrines in Palestine. And we have seen similar provocative acts against Christian property also in Jerusalem around the same area. So the message again here is a very provocative, very strong message of incitement. He was trying to exact a Palestinian response of some kind so that he would once more highlight himself as the savior of the Jewish state and as the new face of Israeli politics.
Giorgio, how provocative do you think that this visit was?
Well, I certainly agree with my guest, with my colleague in Seattle. Everything he said, there's no doubt it was extremely provocative. This is an ultra far-right fascist government that's now in power in Israel. I think the leadership is trying to send out the message that it can get away with these kinds of actions. There are obviously power imbalances in the world that enable the Palestinians to, enable the Israelis to do things like this and not be held accountable. It doesn't seem that there are really any countries in the world that are going to take any types of actions to counter Israel. And this is about humiliating and dehumanizing the Palestinians and doing it in a very proud way.
Guy, can I cross to you? Do you concur with all of those views?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's worth putting this in context. I mean, we have had instances in the past where leading Israeli officials have done similar sorts of things. If you remember when Ariel Sharon went up to the mountain in September 2000, just before the start of the Second Intifada, and that was seen as one of the things that led to the uprising taking place there. So there is certainly a considerable amount of awareness of what this all means, and so I concur with what's been said so far, that really what's being said here is a way of sending a message that this government is going to be as harsh as possible on the Palestinians.
Nasim, if I can cross to you for a second. Had this visit taken place 20 or 25 or 30 years ago, we might well have had riots immediately afterwards. So what's changed now? What's different about this visit versus previous years?
Well, I think Palestinians generally are not as organized as they would have been 20 years ago. You probably would have seen an uprising in the way we saw in 2000 and also in the 80s. So Palestinians are disjointed. There's a crackdown on Palestinian resistance, and that would be one of the reasons why you don't see the kind of intifada we saw in the 80s and in the year 2000. But that said, I think Ben-Gvir's visit really, it is in a way a milestone. We cannot really compare it to, say, Sharon's visit to Al-Aqsa Mosque, partly because Ben-Gvir is a convicted supporter of a terrorist organization. He supports Baruch Goldstein. His vision of Israel is that of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who wants to kick out all of Palestinians from historic Palestine. So he is in the very right spectrum, extreme of Israeli politics, which is why Western politicians are embarrassed and ashamed that they have to support this government, Israeli government, and they don't really want to have any dealings with him. So he has really exposed the real Israel, which the Palestinians for decades have trying to expose, which is the apartheid, racist Israel that Palestinians have been commenting about. So I think this is really a milestone, and given it's come at a time when human rights organizations around the world have a consensus, wall-to-wall consensus, that Israel is an apartheid state. This really exposes the reality on the ground, which Western governments can no longer ignore. Though they're trying to, I think, the veil has come off, and everyone can see Israel for what it really is.
Ramzy, if I can cross to you. Nasim mentioned there that the Palestinian response has been less organized than it would have been in, say, previous decades. Is that not a little bit of a surprise when we consider Telegram, when we consider social media, when we've seen what social media can do over the Arab Spring, for instance?
Right. So I do agree with Nasim regarding kind of his overall kind of political estimation that indeed there is the Palestinian society is struggling under the extremely difficult conditions of the siege in Gaza and the constant crackdown on the West Bank, especially the northern parts, Jenin, Nablus, Qalqilia, and others. I do think that the Palestinians' supposed lack of response is part of a larger strategy that kind of began around May 2021. It was then the Palestinian resistance in Gaza responded to Israeli provocations and violence in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, and that took the Israelis by complete surprise. They thought that Gaza was pretty much in ruins and there is no way that Gaza is going to enter the fray, but they did. And since then, there has been at least an attempt at the part of the Palestinian resistance in all of its forms to be in initiative takers, as opposed to allow themselves to be sitting on the, kind of waiting for some kind of an Israeli provocations in which everybody just jump in there and just allow Israel to gain whatever political value or political assets from the Palestinian response. So I think the lack of Palestinian response is in itself a response that the war from now on is going to also be determined by the time and the need of the Palestinian people. And I think they've done that quite successfully in May 2021. Israel tried to drag them into a major war in the following year, also in May, and they have failed. But I wouldn't discount that to be part of the fact that Palestinians are disorganized. To the contrary, at this moment, we're talking about an actual armed rebellion that is gaining momentum in the West Bank, something that we haven't seen in many years.
Well, let's have a look at some of the responses that have come through from the various different bodies involved in this process. At the United Nations, for instance, UN Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia and the Pacific, Khalid Kari, said,
on 3rd January, Israel's new Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, conducted a visit accompanied by heavy security detail to the holy site in Jerusalem. The visit was the first to the site by an Israeli minister since 2017. While the visit was not accompanied or followed by violence, it is seen as particularly inflammatory given Mr. Ben-Gvir's past advocacy for changes to the status quo.
Now, that's the comment relatively measured coming out of the United Nations. Guy, China's normally very, very diplomatic.
There's been a number of times that when the Chinese spoken on this issue that they've talked about the importance of the two-state solution, the importance of negotiations, the importance of the peace process. But generally, the way they see it is that it's not up to them to lead that. And if you went and followed what was said at the Security Council last week, China's ambassador made it very clear that whereas they wanted to see a resolution, they said it was up to other parties to do so. And that's actually been very consistent with China's approach towards the conflict more generally. Usually what they tend to have is very good relations with both sides. And certainly we can get into talking about China's relations with Israel. But also, on the other hand, China's relationship with the Palestinians is a very long-lasting one, which goes back to the 1960s, and is basically sort of associated with strong sense of solidarity. So, in that respect, the rhetoric is there, but in terms of actual action, very little.
Okay, if I were to have the Chinese ambassador, though, here in the studio with me, and I were to start grilling him about the Chinese strategy towards Israel, Palestine, the Arabian region, he would probably look at me and say something to the effect of, China's policy hasn't changed. We have to deal with the Arab world, we have to deal with the Israeli world, we follow the guidance of the Arab League. It's their strategy that's changed, not ours. How fair is that, Guy?
Yeah, and so the Chinese have, as you pointed out, they've been cultivating very good relations with all parties, all states in the Middle East. But it's generally tended to sort of be relations with individual countries, and it's been primarily about economic and commercial interests as opposed to getting involved in terms of security or defense matters. So the Chinese very much see any kind of solution or resolution to the problems that are coming out of the region as coming from the region itself. So as a result, this has helped them sort of sidestep, dealing with awkward situations like the Arab-Israeli conflict, and enabled them to be able to cultivate very good ties with both Israel and the Palestinians.
Giorgio, if I were to compare and contrast statements coming out of the United Nations, statements coming out of China, statements coming out of elsewhere, with those coming out of the European Union seems much more mixed, much more nonplussed about the situation in Israel. Let me give you a for instance here. This is a soundbite from the German Foreign Ministry spokesman, Christopher Berger.
The German government rejects one-sided steps which endanger the status quo of Temple Mount, and we have repeatedly made this clear. Yesterday's visit is a provocation, and that is why we very clearly reject this move. We expect the new Israeli government to commit to a continuation of the tried and tested practice around the holy sites in Jerusalem and to put a stop to further deliberate provocations.
Giorgio, that for the European Union is a relatively strong statement. If we looked at how they'd voted at the UN votes with regards to Israel, we'd find them very, very split between the 27 members. What's going on with the EU's response?
Obviously, with the conflict going on in Ukraine, that is the focus of European countries right now. The issues in Palestine are not at the center of European policymakers' attention right now. Now, having said that, it's very clear that the European officials do not, or at least many European officials do not welcome this extremism on the part of the Israeli government. They wish the Israeli government would conduct itself differently. And yes, we have these statements, there's this rhetoric. But at the end of the day, I don't really see Western governments, especially the United States, but also European governments, taking any action. These statements are well and good, but if they're not associated with any actions that hold Israel accountable, I don't think there's going to be any incentive for Tel Aviv to change its conduct. So I think the European states are acting in a pretty weak manner here, at least from my perspective.
Can they act from a position of strength, though? You've mentioned there that their attention is distracted, it's focused on Ukraine. They've already got a sanctions war going on with Russia at the very least. There's certainly a war of words going on between them. Can they afford to get into a row with Israel at this time?
Well, those are political calculations that officials in Europe have to make. But I mean, let's go back to last year when Russia violated Ukraine's national sovereignty. There was all this, talk about the international rules-based order, talk about sovereign rights, and talk about how countries aren't allowed to violate the sovereignty of their smaller, weaker neighbors. There really is a hypocrisy on the part of Western governments that don't apply those standards to Israel. There definitely are deep relations between Israel and some countries in Europe. There is some leverage the Europeans have. But again, I think for political reasons, the Europeans are choosing not to use that leverage.
Ramzy, I'm going to put it to you. Political reasons for not using that leverage. What do you think?
Well, I'm not even sure if at this point, in terms of Israeli-Western, especially European relationship, we can actually even talk about leverage, simply because the United States continues to support Israel unconditionally and blindly, even before the swearing in of the current government of Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu, and the others. Israel, the United States hinted that possibly the U.S. is going to refrain from engaging certain members of that cabinet. And at the end of the day, actually within 24 hours, they reversed that position. Sadly, the Europeans always look at the Americans for insight. And as we have seen throughout the Ukraine-Russia war, really Europe has emerged, in the words of Noam Chomsky, to be just another client regime. So we really can't expect Europe to have an independent position on Palestine, Israel, not anytime soon. And I think the Israelis know it, and they know it very well. And this is why they keep pushing, knowing that there will be no consequences to their action whatsoever.
Nasim, if I can cross to you, do you think Europe has any leverage here at all? Is there anything Europe can do on its own? Or is it all down to the United States and other actors in this story?
Well, Europe can, if it wanted to, but it's made a political decision not to do anything, and because of a number of reasons. I would say one of the reasons for the inaction of Europe and also the US is because they have a domestic constituency, which, say, China doesn't have. There's a strong, powerful pro-Israeli lobby in Europe, in Israel, breathing down the necks of various politicians. Obama himself complained about that in his book, where he spoke about AIPAC and a number of other pro-Israeli organizations that would constantly knock on his door and put pressure on him. So I think this domestic pressure does not exist in China. And China can make those strong, powerful remarks. But again, it's boilerplate reactions, those comments, said in a much harsher way than, for example, Europe would. But there's no action at the end of the day, even with China. So I think when it comes to China, it does in my view, used the Palestinian issue somewhat as a wedge issue to also enhance its reputation in the eyes of the Muslim world, partly because I think of what is happening in Xinjiang. There's a lot of criticism, as you know, from the Muslim world. Recently, there was a delegation of 30 imams who said China is combating terrorism. So in light of all that, I think China is also using its support for the Palestinians, though it's a long, long support which goes back to the 60s. I think that the strong and powerful rhetoric is really part of its way of enhancing its reputation in the eyes of the Muslim world.
Guy, I'm going to cross that over to you. You're the China expert here on the panel. You were hearing from Nasim there that China may be using the situation in Palestine to distract attention from the Uyghur problem that it has in its northwest. What do you make of that?
Well, certainly it's the case that most countries in the Middle East seem to have this tacit understanding not to talk about the Uyghurs when it comes to China. There seems to be the sort of general understanding on both sides that they won't raise it, and the relationship with China, with the trade, with the investment, can continue. Of course, that does create some problems every once in a while. These things do bubble to the surface. For example, Turkey that has sort of raised it in the past and found itself in a really somewhat awkward position. But if I can just come back to this issue about Europe as well and whether it has any leverage. I mean, one thing that we also need to keep in mind is that with the war in the Ukraine, and what that has meant is that the Europeans have now had to start looking for alternative sources of energy, sort of to diverse away from Russia. And so one of the main potential sources that they might be looking for is Israel, because of course they have a large gas field that they want to develop just off the East Mediterranean coast. And so that's going to make it a lot harder. It's not just political now, it's also economic. For Europe to actually want to put pressure on Israel, they've also got to think about the economic cost to themselves.
Ramzy, so is this a bigger deal for Europe than it had previously appeared in, say, previous generations?
Yeah, it's ironic that about 100 years ago, it was Britain that kind of signed the deed of Palestine off to the Zionist movement and to Israel. And having times changed since then. Now, neither the UK nor the rest of Europe are in a position to dictate on Israel anything. And again, this is the kind of one of the ironies of history. And for us to actually expect the West and Europe in particular to kind of have a change of heart about Palestine under the current geopolitical conditions, I think it's just far-fetched. That doesn't mean necessarily that China is going to be that new kid in the block that is going to come with the new ideas and new visions and new solutions, although I do think it's worth exploring that possibility. A few years ago, China came up with the so-called 4-point peace plan. They've held meetings, they invited various Palestinian factions to Beijing, and they are trying to engage at some level, at least trying to also send a message to the Americans that we are willing to fill that vacuum in case of your absence. Russia has done the same thing, and to a greater degree of success. But I think there is much political leverage that China in due time could in fact be exploring in the Middle East, especially with the more or less the retreat of the Americans from the region and the lack of the West credibility in general.
Giorgio, last question to you, if I may. If you're the Palestinian Authority right now, what do? You do nothing, you look weak, you do something, you're instantly held up as either being violent or overreacting. How on earth do you play this? You're in a catch-22 situation all the time, aren't you?
And obviously the Palestinians face a huge dilemma. It's obviously not for me to decide how they handle the situation that's been imposed on them for many decades. But I would say, though, that I think what matters significantly is the discourse where I am in Washington, D.C. Before policies change, discourse and conversations have to change. And I think that it's important for the Palestinians to push back against Zionist narratives and to do a better job of demonstrating to the US and other countries what is actually taking place with the reality of ethnic cleansing and everything else. I don't necessarily think US policy toward Israel or Palestine will change anytime soon, but I do think that over time it will eventually change. And I really think it comes down to influencing discourse here in Washington. And after that can happen, as I said, maybe US foreign policy will change. And that, I believe, will be a huge game changer.
Ramzy, Nasim, Guy, Giorgio, thank you very much, all four of you, for joining me today. Remember, you can see more about this discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all of the team here, goodbye. Thank you for watching.